Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Fred Nexus event for June. We've got a few other people that are joining us, and we'll get started in just a minute. All right. Well, welcome everyone to the Fred Nexus event for June. Our virtual Nexus, what gets in the way of belonging, how Airbnb fosters real conversations. We're looking forward to spending some time today with Melissa Thomas Hunt, who's the global head of diversity and belonging for Airbnb. And we're going to learn more about Melissa in just a few minutes. A couple of things that I did want to go ahead and talk about, if I can get my slide here to move, is what is Fred Leadership? Some of you might be joining us for the first time, and Fred is all about ethics and inclusion and transformation, and we stand for the future of executive development. And a couple of things to point out about the Fred community, which I've been a longtime member of, and can say firsthand that we live this. Our mission through Fred Leadership is to inspire, to nurture, and to connect principled, honest, and compassionate leaders who exemplify and are committed to developing ethical, inclusive, and transformational leadership in both themselves and their organizations. And one of the great things about Fred is we really are this beacon for ethical, inclusive, and transformational leadership. And we believe that Fred leadership is courageous dialogue and ethical action. And I can't think of a better person to spend our morning with here on the East Coast than Melissa Thomas Hunt. The great thing about Fred too is we're a membership-based community. You can certainly become a member of Fred today, and would invite you to take a look at the fredleadership.org website. And as part of being a member, our Fred Week 2021 is coming up, and it's going to be held virtually October 4th through the 8th, headed up and sponsored by my good friends at ESA Business School. And they are fantastic and working closely with Fred to put together a wonderful program. So I hope that we'll see all of each of you there as well. So with that, Melissa, welcome to Fred.
Thanks, Kelly. I'm so delighted to be here with you and with Fred as well.
That's great. Well, so Melissa, I want to start off talking a little bit about one of the things we do here at Fred that we like to talk about is campfire chats. So when we come together at our conference, we would come together almost like we were in a campfire. And so I hope that that'll be the spirit of our conversation today. And one of the things I want to bring up to everybody is that you and I are both actually in Charlottesville, Virginia today, which is kind of neat.
That is
we're
correct.
both in the same city. And Melissa and I have an interesting history together in that I'm currently the learning lead for a startup nonprofit being incubated in the Mid-Ohio Food Bank called ReadySkill, that is bringing together workforce development, skilling, and leadership, pulling together social services, education, and jobs. And so, Melissa, what's really interesting about that is I think about some of the conversations that you and I have had over the years when we work together in the academic world, and some of the work that you're doing with Airbnb as well around this idea of belonging. And so the fact that we're still both in Charlottesville, I think, is really interesting, because this is a city that's learning and it's healing from complicated is not necessarily the right word, but it is an interesting story of a location, particularly as it comes with race and gender and equity and inclusion and even belonging. I remember when my family first made the move from California to Charlottesville, and my, then middle school son came and said, "I don't want to go to that gas station anymore, Mom. There's a Confederate flag in it." And I'm like, "What are you talking about? What do you mean there's a Confederate flag?" So there's a beauty of this town and the aura of intellectual curiosity. And of course, we've got great food and wine and beer and all those other things, but there's also tons of stories around challenge and difference and inspiration. And so, just to kind of get started, what's Charlottesville to you? Like,
wow. So much is flowing through Kelly. So I'll say that when I made the move from Cornell to UVA with my family, which is in 2009, and it was a very deliberate move that was contemplated over about a year and a half. My children, and I have three, were then, my daughter was 11, about to turn 12, and my boys were 8 and 5. So all sort of in this really cute phase. And I'm a New Yorker, and so and I had never lived in the South, and so had done a lot of asking of questions. And Charlottesville, in lots of ways, became home. People were very good to our family. Our children were invited into homes. Our children had, for the most part, good academic experiences. There were some challenges along the way where we needed to advocate. But I'll say, fast forward in the summer, and really the event started in the spring of 2017. We were in the process of moving. I was in the process of moving to Vanderbilt. And in August of 2017, which is really when people think about events, we were actually up in Massachusetts vacationing. And so we're watching it on TV and getting text messages and calls. I find myself getting emotional because we felt removed and our friends and family were there on the ground. And it was so hard to see Charlottesville put on the map in a global way for these sort of racist events. And I found myself in a more defensive posture in defending Charlottesville, which had allowed our family to thrive and grow, and which we were hypercritical of. Its relationship and UVA's relationship to slavery in the South and Jefferson's, et cetera. But at a fundamental level, it had been a place where we felt safe. And so then I fast forward, and when I took the job at Airbnb, Airbnb particularly then was a very San Francisco focused company. And so really the only option, didn't think of anything else, was to pick up wholesale and move to San Francisco. Pandemic hit, all my kids ended up back at home in San Francisco. It was clear I was going to be remote for a while. And we felt relatively disconnected from community there. And the place we chose to come back to was Charlottesville so that we could regroup and ground. And particularly in the aftermath of the civil unrest and sort of racial awakening last summer, I actually felt safer having my boys and my husband, in particular, all who are African-American men, in Charlottesville, because I know there are people who care and would reach out. And ultimately, when we talk about belonging and community, it's about a place where you feel like you can be yourself, and there are others who see you and appreciate and value and respect you and want you in the community.
Well, I love how that even a community that has this complication of these polarities of pooling can still, can allow you and your family to feel like they are at their best and their true selves. And we feel like that as well. So we talked a little bit about that Fred is a community that connects and inspires, right? Those that exemplify and cultivate ethical, inclusive, and transformational leadership. And I see that in you and the conversations that you and I have had, whether it's been on grounds or I feel like I remember very clearly interviewing with you in 2013 when I first met you, when I was in California, and just that conversation has kind of stuck with me around this idea of being your true self. And so tell us a little bit about your journey into leadership at Airbnb and like what's inspired you along the way. I know family is something that is super important to you from an inspirational standpoint, but like how did you get there?
So I'll start a little bit with the bit about family, and then I'll sort of jump into a quick version of my career trajectory, which was nonlinear, and then anything that we want to talk about, we can revisit. So my parents are both educators, and my father was part of the Great Migration of Blacks who moved from the South up to the North to industrial areas. He and his two siblings and his parents took the train up to Detroit and made a life for themselves there. And for him, the opportunity to go to a specialized high school, Cass Tech, and then to go to Wayne State University and to become a teacher were really transformative in terms of the life that they could have in the North. They were actually landowners in the South, but as I came to learn only recently, it was very dangerous for them to be landowners as Black people in the late 30s and 40s, and so came to the North sort of for refuge of sorts. My mother's family are from the Caribbean, from St. Croix. My grandparents came to New York City to work in people's homes to advance that way. And ultimately, my mother's father got his college degree from City College. And so again, education has just been something that has been really important and a great uplifter for our family. I think in the times that we live now, there's lots of talk about skills first, and there are opportunities in the tech world to not necessarily have a 4-year degree and still have a very sustainable, generative life. And so education is not the only path to it, but it is certainly one of the more predictable ways, particularly for certain portions of the population. So I've always been focused on education, and my parents were always focused on the family, of course, but beyond the family, always doing more. I can remember them doing, voter registration and petitioning and being in the PTA and serving on nonprofit boards, all from an early age. It was just what they did after they came home from work, and we saw them do it. So I think my brother and I were raised with this ethos of you always have to do more for those beyond your immediate family. And so, I was just indoctrinated with that. I also had, I demonstrated a little bit of sort of what we would call now STEM prowess at an early age. And my parents, being pragmatic, were like, you're going to be an engineer. I didn't even know what an engineer was, but I knew that I liked math and science, so I was good at math and science, and I had the good fortune for a portion of time to actually have a full tuition scholarship my first year of college in engineering. And I probably force fit the areas of engineering because a full scholarship to Princeton was a big ticket item. I started as an electrical engineer. That didn't take really well. I'm a pretty applied thinker that goes from the applied to the theoretical and back to the applied. And at that point in time, I really couldn't get a handle on electricity and circuits and what this really meant in the real world. Computer science was a potential option. And if I had known that computer science was about solving problems, then I think I really would have gravitated to it, but that wasn't the framing. And that's a big disappointment because I went to Bronx Science and I love my experience there. But even in that wonderful environment, I think there were so many people who weren't captivated by math and science and computer science because they didn't understand what the real world analog was. I ended up graduating from Princeton with a chemical engineering degree. I had always loved chemistry. It's the hardest thing that I ever did on the engineering side of it. My 3 kids, my PhD, the last 2 years as an executive at Airbnb during a pandemic at a travel company, getting my undergraduate chemical engineering degree was super hard. But I learned a lot about persistence, endurance, taking one step at a time, just my own resilience. And I also had the opportunity during that time to run a student agency, and I became really interested in business and entrepreneurship. But going back to sort of the pragmatism of my parents, I ended up being offered and taking a job at IBM as a marketing rep, as a sales rep on a large account team. So I was supporting what we then called major money center bank. That terminology is nowhere to be found now. And I was supporting trading floor operations, selling mid-range computers. And in that process, I really became interested in the group dynamics, also reflected on my experience in groups in college, because no problem set was done independently. it was intentionally designed to be a collaborative endeavor because it's the nature of engineering work. And now I got to observe teams in another format, working with other sales reps, supporting across a financial institution. And I also got the opportunity to do a lot of negotiations. And I was introduced formally to the study of negotiations and fell in love with it. It was a tough time for IBM. It was a tough time for my financial clients, but I got to watch them go through mergers. I got to see the dynamics of teams. I got to see the ways people were trying to demonstrate their expertise, but not give too much up, because if they gave it all up, then they would make themselves dispensable. And I am a student of people, and that's always been informal. But in that moment, I realized I wanted to do that. So I took some classes. I found out there was a field called organizational behavior that would allow me to marry my love of studying people with the business world, with more formal study, and also research, which I love as well. And I ended up going off to Northwestern, to Kellogg, studied negotiations, did a little on team dynamics, and 4 years later ended up on the faculty at WashU at the Olin School, with some stints, a visiting stint at Stanford, and then moving on to Cornell, where I was for 9 years before coming to UVA, to Darden, where I was for 8 years before moving on to Vanderbilt. While at UVA, I started doing more in the space around teams and what gets in the way of people contributing their expertise. And we often, those who were studying it, really didn't consider the status hierarchies that emerge in teams. And those status hierarchies often emerge along dimensions of difference. And so I became interested in the role of an individual's gender in the way in which their expertise wasn't used, and the often negative impact on performance, because the true experts weren't the ones who were able to exert the most influence in a group. I became interested in how the package or configuration that someone comes in affects the competence perceptions that are held of them. And ultimately, I wanted to both help individuals better articulate their value and be seen for their potential, and also help organizations not leave any resources on the table. Why would you sub-optimize on the full range of human capital at your disposal if you don't have to? And so how could organizations actually see people for the talent that they have to bring, and not be obscured by some of the biases or stereotypes, be they consciously held or unconsciously held? And so I transformed that into more administrative work, and was doing that at Vanderbilt as well, when someone that I had been in a practitioner scholar multi-round endeavor reached out to me and said, we're looking for someone to head up global diversity and belonging at Airbnb. Would you talk to us? And I thought, I'm an academic, maybe an academic administrator. But I had been a guest on Airbnb for 5 or 6 years. I had had positive experiences. I knew nothing about the company, only my own guest side experiences. But what I learned through the early conversations was that they actually had a mission of creating a world where anyone can belong anywhere, that belonging was central to their stated mission. And what I had been trying to do in my administrative roles was to create environments in which a diverse array of faculty, students, staff, administrators felt like they belonged. And so to find a company that had articulated that value and that mission felt really powerful. And so the conversation continued. I can tell you more about that.
Well, we definitely want to learn more about that. One of the things that I pick up about your career is this theoretical applied, right? And so when you just the story that you just told, right? Okay, applied. Oh, I picked this up with groups. Theoretical. I'm going to study this. Oh, by the way, what's happening? And okay, how do we apply this? And you've gotten an opportunity to do that at Airbnb, which we definitely want to learn more about. I do want to take us back just real quick to about a little over a year ago, right before the pandemic, I think maybe a week before, you were part of a panel. I like to call it the marvelous trio. I've had a great honor to work with all three of you amazing ladies. Laura Morgan Roberts, who has just put out some really great work, particularly in the last year, phenomenal work around equity, inclusion, identity, all of these things. Erica James, who did dean at Wharton and former dean at Emory Goizueta, and also incredible faculty member at Darden. And you were talking, and Laura asked this question, and I was just on the edge of my seat. And because I had been in DC and wanted to come over live, and I rewatched it a couple of weeks ago. She said, imagine that moment when you had that first feeling or calling to lead in the ways which you are leading now. How did you step in and change the conversation or start the dialogue around leadership? And so you've touched on that a little bit, but I'd love to hear your perspective on it, particularly as you came into the role at Airbnb, technology company, all kinds of crazy things happening, right?
So I'll tell you the moment. I think I mentioned this then, but it's fundamental to, I think, how I show up in these situations. I think I was in second grade or fourth grade, and the boys were teasing the girls about not being good at sports, and kickball was pretty big back then. And I decided that I was going to challenge the boys to a game of girls versus boys kickball. And I rallied and I got the girls who were going to play. And, it was an event at like recess indoors in the gym. And we lost miserably, right? So there are all sorts of notions about like, how do you build a team and like what competencies and like, how do you really make sure people are ready to show up and play and feel good about it? But I think the notion is that it's never about me. It's always about other people. It's about advocacy. It's about creating options for others and allowing others' potential to be seen. And so that was a really early, child version of that. But I think in all the places that I've gone, I've always wanted to understand what the on-the-ground experience is across a wide array of groups, and often groups that never see me in my role, my diversity role, as being their person. I'll give you an example of that. I'd been at Darden for quite some time when Scott Beardsley asked me to be a senior associate dean and global chief diversity officer. And one of the things I wanted to do was really connect with the leaders of some of the student organizations. And there are some obvious organizations who would see me in that role as being their person. But I actually wanted to look for leaders of organizations that I thought had bridging capability. And so I reached out to the student head of the Darden Veterans Organization, who I actually happened to have in class, but the quarter had just started. And I reached out to him and I asked, can we meet? And I remember being in a conference room and he had his laptop out and it was sort of very officious and he was about to take notes, like he had been called into the principal's office. And I said, I really just wanted to talk to you about two things. One, I know that the veteran community is in the numerical minority here, and I just wanted to understand some of the needs and the concerns of the community and how, as I think about creating belonging and fostering inclusion, that community can feel more included here. And I said, the second thing is that when I think of individuals who have served, particularly those who here at Darden who've been officers, you probably have more experience interacting closely and leading and being led by a diverse array of individuals. And I would love to leverage that experience and that learning in the broader community. And so he closed his laptop and he leaned forward and took a deep breath. And he realized so the notion was, I'm here to help. I'm here to help and I see you and I value you. And so that's how I typically show up. And it's often easier to do that with individuals who may perceive that they are in some way subordinate to me, right? That I'm paying attention to them, I'm interested in their cause. But I actually learned late in my time at Darden that I have to lean in with people who I actually perceive as being my superiors or more senior in tenure to me, that I have to demonstrate caring. I think the thing that we have to realize about leadership is that it's people who are in roles, on teams, being held accountable, and they never leave their humanity at home. We say they do, maybe, but they don't. And so if we care for individuals and demonstrate that we see them holistically, that we understand that there are challenges that even if they don't want to bring into the workplace are in the back of their thoughts that are clouding their judgments, then it clears the space, it builds trust, it builds relationships. That's how, I leaned in with our executives. I would say, tell me what the business challenges are. Like, what are you struggling with? And then we would pivot to a conversation about, like, what are the challenges, with your team, and how comfortable do you feel in the diversity and belonging space, and how can I help, and what questions do you have? Like, ask me anything. And so that's always been my entree point in leading. It's about other people. It's about advocating for voices not represented. It's about seeing people as they want to be seen. It's about creating safe spaces. All of those things.
Love that. I love that. And it connects with the research that you do as well. So once again, I'm seeing a pattern here, as you identified. Applied, theoretical, applied. One of the things I've heard you talk about is asking this question at Airbnb, and would love to hear how, in a pretty short period of time, with just a ton of upheaval the last 2 years, how did you get this concept of belonging to move from being something that's in our vision and strategy statement to actionable amongst the population, right, of a technology company?
A technology again. So I feel really fortunate, because what I was able to discern as I was making the decision to join was that belonging really was something that was central, that employees at the company came to the company because they love travel, but because they love this mission that we were connecting people across the world. First through people staying in others' homes and being hosted, but then also through having experiences and bringing people who were traveling in the same area together to have a common experience when they otherwise wouldn't have been able to meet other people and see more nuanced and local things. So I had the benefit of believing that the company, that was really a value. And I also recognized that they didn't actually how to do it, particularly in our employee base, but often in the guest and host arena. And I thought, well, I know how to do that. So they're committed, and I think I know how to do it. The question is, are they going to give me the opportunity to do it in the way that I really believe, which is an embedded approach? Like, advancing diversity and belonging can't be a sideshow. It can't be something that, like, the D&B team does off to the side and shows up with the headliners. It actually means that you have to pull apart your practices and your policies. You have to interrogate them. You have to really ask questions about who's having different experiences. Where is it going awry? Where's the thing that we think we're doing really not actually happening on the ground? And I had the good fortune that the CEO had made these 16 diversity and belonging commitments literally on the day that I said yes. And I remember I was at Stanford for a conference, and I came up to the office, and I was getting a data presentation, and he came in after having had a challenging meeting, and he said, I couldn't say your name, but I told him you were coming, and I made these commitments. What he didn't say was that my initials were next to those commitments. But it actually ended up being a tremendous accelerator, because everyone knew that Brian Chesky had made these commitments, and so it was on his radar, and that I was there to help him deliver, along with the support of Beth Axelrod, our VP of Employee Experience, our CHRO, who was an incredible supporter just in paving the way and helping me understand how to be effective in that environment. And so very quickly, so one of the commitments was to stand up a diversity and belonging task force. I rebranded that. I called it a SWAT team. I grounded it in our employee experience, our HR organization, because the major levers were there. There was, learning and talent and recruiting, and even our culture. The keepers of our cultures sit in employee experience. And then we went out and we had town halls, and I traveled globally. Part of the traveling globally so quickly was in my second interview with the CEO, which was really intense. He started off and he said, what are you going to do in your first 90 days? And we were on a WebEx. And I said, well, I'm going to talk to employees. Where? Inside the US, outside the US? And I said, well, both. Well, where are you going to go? So we proceeded along these lines. And what I said to him was, we are a global company, and most of the business comes from outside the US pre-pandemic. But at the same time, because we're a US-centric company, we can't run from the challenges to diversity and belonging that sort of pervade the US context, but we also have to understand more broadly. And so I wanted to make good on my promise that I wasn't going to be the global head of diversity and belonging that focused on the US. And so I got on a plane and I went to EMEA and ultimately went to APAC on multiple occasions, and it was on my way to a lot of other places when we all got grounded. But that allowed me to actually understand from people in person, through Slack, through emails, what the things were that we were doing well. And there were a phenomenal number of things that we were doing well. We had, for a company our size, we had a huge number of employee resource groups, 19 different employee resource groups at that time, over 100 chapters globally. A commitment and set of core values that you stop any employee and they could articulate them. So I had a lot to leverage, but there were also opportunity areas in that it had been a year since someone had been in the role. It had not been an executive team role beforehand. And our executives didn't know what was taking place on the ground with employees and their experience of belonging, and that there were divergences in the experience. And I got to come in and elevate that and articulate. And we did an inventory of where we were, and then we distilled it down to a document that we circulated across the company after first presenting it to my executive team colleagues. And they raised their hands and they said, "You didn't ask us to make personal commitments to D&B." And I said, "I can do that. I'll be back next week." And so I did that. So, every executive has made a commitment that they'll be on their own learning journey. Now it's been a year, so there's toggling in and out in terms of what that looks like. But they're all committed to growing because they realize the greater their comfort, the more they understand the employees, and they can role model the behaviors that we espouse as a company.
What did some people say? What gets in the way of belonging? Like, what were some of the responses to that question?
Fear of saying the wrong thing.
Yeah.
That they're going to be judged for not getting the terminology right, or using an old term and that's evolved, and then negative attributions are made about them. Also the social risk, and you think executives have social risk, and they didn't use that term, but essentially, if I use my voice or stand up or speak out for this, aren't there other people that I'm going to marginalize? And what I've shared with them, with leadership, is if it's something that you think you should speak out on, you should speak out, and your silence is marginalizing a whole other group of people. And they never thought of silence as being an action in and of itself. But it's mostly of saying the wrong thing. And the other thing is, and this is true of leaders and executives at most companies, but particularly for us over the last 15, 16 months, our leaders and our executives are incredibly busy. And there are things that every single employee wants them to be doing. It is incredible, our story over the last year as a travel company that actually ended up having an IPO and a very successful one. And that's because a lot of people kept their eye on the ball. And therefore that means that they need really good partners and people who have a singular focus on the diversity, inclusion, equity efforts, but who they're willing to allow in as coaches and partners. And part of the not knowing what to say, it's just very real. They're not experts in it, and we can spend time with them. But one of the biggest unlocks that was not on my radar was, if you have a really good internal comms team that is fluent in diversity and inclusion, you can literally help executives find the words to create the culture and to signal their values in the space. And we are very fortunate to have a very robust, uber competent set of internal comms managers who support our leaders and executives. And my team, I actually have a dedicated one to diversity and belonging. So she becomes the keeper of the messaging. She and I go back and forth, and then she's able to cascade it to the other internal comms managers. So then that messaging shows up in all hands and in executive newsletters and in tidbits. And so we actually, it's a change management process, but in micro increments. that we're creating that climate and that culture and that cadence of talking about these things.
And so that gets to this idea of having these real conversations, right?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
can you talk a little bit about that? Because I would think that sometimes it's just starting that conversation, right? I remember one of my first days when I started my role at UCLA, I had a staff member come in and say, hey, I just want you to know that I'm trans. And it was like my first day at work. And I was like I wasn't sure what to do or say. What my instinct was, okay, well, let's talk a little bit about that and what can I do to support the environment that you need to be successful, right?
Yeah.
But that was kind of a gut instinct thing. And it was initially like, oh my gosh, did I do it the right way? Like, how do you have those real conversations? How do you encourage that?
And I think, it's phenomenal that you started with a question, right? Centering it on the other person. How do I support you in this? And there are going to be those times where caring enough about the other person, demonstrating that you are interested in them, that you ask questions, is going to go really far. The other piece of it now, and particularly after the last year, there's so much information that anyone who's motivated to learn, to begin that learning journey, you can go pretty far on your own. And so when people show up and they haven't done the basics, there's less grace that often is afforded because it's literally at our fingertips. There's so many times where I'm in a meeting and a new term comes up and I'm on my phone, like looking, like trying to figure out what's going on. So I think, having that learning agility in the diversity and belonging space, trying not to be defensive, being open to the fact that people see the world differently, they've lived different experiences, and just because something falls outside of what you've observed or your lived experience doesn't mean that someone else didn't have that experience. So often individuals, and particularly people of color, people who come from groups that have marginalized identities, feel gaslit, which is literally like the lighting slowly being turned down, with the notion that it's not perceivable. So you make a statement about an experience or an interaction that you've had, and someone says, oh, I'm sure they really didn't mean it that way. Well, I felt it that way. Right. And so being curious, inquisitive, being willing to do your own research, and then showing up and saying, like, I've done some reading and I have some questions. I think people are very eager to engage at that particular starting point and juncture.
Yeah, absolutely. I love some of the words that you've used around, we've got that accelerator, the learning agility. It's up to you as an individual to continue to learn and to get smart about and to be curious, right? And ultimately have courage to be able to have the conversations. So Melissa, we have a question that's come in on the chat from our friend Peter Hurst, who is up at MIT actually. And one of the things that he's talking about on the question of inclusion and belonging, we're all now grappling with questions of what our workplaces are going to look like as we transition back from the pandemic. And different parts of the world are in different places, right? With that. Right. And he said that, we're hearing in this week's report from Microsoft that many organizations may be facing significant attrition, even if they do offer greater flexibility in remote working. So how can we create and maintain a feeling of belonging amid all of this disruption? And is this an opportunity or a threat to our efforts to be more inclusive? Peter always asks really good questions, by the way.
That's a phenomenal question, and certainly one that we're grappling with, as are many other companies. I'll start by saying that anything initially perceived as a threat, I always see as having potential to be an opportunity. It's clear that for many, and certainly not all, the opportunity has arisen to potentially work remotely. And I think that in those instances, the productivity data is suggesting that people are as productive, if not more productive. The only friction in that would be that because children have not been in school, and so caregivers have been homeschooling or coming up with creative options, that has been a bit of a drag on productivity. But if you were to assume that everyone could return, children could return to the regular school environments, then I think we would see that productivity away from the office is actually may increase. And so the question becomes, how do we foster the community and culture? And I will say that one of the things that just jumped out at me early in Airbnb was every single office I went to around the globe, and I was in Seoul, and I was in Singapore, and I was in Beijing, and I was in Portland and Montreal and many other places. There was a buzz when you walked into the Airbnb office. It was clear people were doing work, but it was clear that people loved being there. They loved being with their colleagues, that some of their best friends were at work. We are a company that loved to gather. There were, events that took place, and people came, and there was a weekly CEO Q&A that our CEO Brian Chesky would do every Thursday at 4 p.m. Pacific time from 888 Brannan. And that was the place you were going to see people that you hadn't seen, and you would catch up, and you knew you could, have that quick conversation, and you could laugh. And so in addition to going remote, for us as a company, I actually think we became super sad, because belonging isn't just a thing that we came to work to create for other people. It was something that we sought and consumed ourselves. And so, I think as companies are thinking about what's the value proposition, they really need to think about sort of going back to what's their mission, what's the core of it. I think our value proposition, we're going to have to realize that belonging is at the center of it, but creating for belonging for our employees is probably going to look a lot different. It's not just going to be the cohesion that we create amongst a team that's meeting only on Zoom. There's certainly things we can do. There are team activities. I'd say do our online experiences. They're fantastic. But it's also about what capacity do we give employees so that they can engage in their local communities and feel like they belong in ways that they couldn't before. So many people are moving back to their childhood communities. They're moving closer to family, to their parents, to siblings, and to friends. Well, if you move closer to them, but you're working 18 hours a day, that's not going to feel like you're cultivating belonging. And so I think that we have to shift and understand that an employee could respond by saying they have huge levels of belonging, even though they're in a remote environment and they're not gathering face-to-face with their peers, but because the employment opportunity has created the capacity for them to find belonging in certain other facets of their life. And so I think we have to be more expansive in how we think about what does it mean to create belonging for our employees? What does it mean to have a value proposition that differentiates one company from another company? And then I also think that, companies need to be really honest about what work means. I mean, we are a company that went through sort of multiple traumas last year. The first being the pandemic and being remote. Second was laying off 1,900 employees. We also had great success. We had our IPO. But the nature of our business is one, particularly coming out of a pandemic where we're in various stages across the globe and we're a global company, well, we can't take our eye off the ball. And so we're still moving really fast. And it would be inappropriate for us to suggest to our employee base that there's a breather coming, because there's not. And I think if you get honest about what the expectations are going to be, then the psychological contract is robust, and people know that they've signed up for it, or people have the opportunity to go to other places. And many people have done a lot of reflecting during this period of time, and they want greater alignment with what brings them joy and values. And for a company to sort of artificially hold on to them, no one's going to be happy in that relationship. So I think just mutual honesty about like what the expectations are, and then encouraging employees to really take that inner journey to see whether what they're seeking maps onto whatever the company is offering in the go forward.
I think that's great. And so we have another question, but I have one quick follow-up on that. I've heard you in our discussions, we've talked about the role of the manager and the leader. And well, one, I guess, would be in having these real conversations, but even in this, what you just talked about, right? So like, how are you getting the managers at the manager level at Airbnb to expand their skill set and capability?
So one of the things that I value about having a background as a business school professor is that we know where you can train individuals to be to develop strong managerial skills. And what I would say is that companies need to think about what type of training and support they're providing to their managers. So often, and I taught about this, but I had not experienced it as much, that that the people who are getting promoted are the individuals who have done stellar as individual contributors, and that has nothing to do with how they would do in managing a team. And that's a huge jump, particularly if they still have some IC responsibilities, because what do we do as human beings? We lean into our strengths. So if we lean into our IC capabilities, it means we're not spending the time nurturing our teams. And part of the nurturing the teams and being taught and building that muscle is helping managers to understand that a fundamental part of their responsibility is to understand what are the drivers of each of their individuals on their teams, and to create a safe environment where they can have real conversations. When I talk to my teammates, I always ask, what is it that they want to do? Like, what do they want to do 5 years down the road? How is what they're doing now map onto that? What are the other experiences that they want? And sometimes I even say, sometimes that opportunity is going to be elsewhere. And I love having you on a team. I have a phenomenal team. But what I know is that when individuals feel fulfilled and when they feel supported, that you're going to get the most out of them. And so even in the interim, while they haven't found that opportunity, they're able to be more productive. And at some point they may move on. They also may come back, or they may move on and suggest that someone else come. It becomes a small world. And so I think helping managers to feel more comfortable having those honest conversations and recognizing that not everyone is going to go up the linear chain at any given firm or organization.
Well, and they're also most likely going to continue to be guests, right? And so you want them to feel
that's right,
to feel that as well. And we have another comment that came in on that. But I do want to get to this comment that came from. I am not going to do well on this name. So Amanita Nadoy, she asked, what do you think about members of the BIPOC community saying they prefer remote work because it better supports their mental health and well-being because of not having to deal with microaggressions, dealing with clueless comments on racial issues and et cetera? So that, our friend Martin Davidson talks a lot about this idea of identity and
yeah. So I was just having this conversation so one of the things as I joined, we had made the decision that we were going to disaggregate our employee engagement data, our belonging data, and so that we could see if there were divergences. And like many companies, if they were to do that, we found that there were divergences in experience by demographic groups. Certainly women versus men in the gender binary globally, we found differences. One of the things that I was super excited about was that in the next iteration of that survey, which is in the fall of 2019, while we found that the divergences, had not dissipated, but it only had been a few months, we found that there had been much higher engagement from our minority populations at the company. And I had actually done I had preempted the results, and I said, so my suspicion is that we will be flat or maybe increase the divergence because we've put such a fine point on it that individuals are now more inclined to raise the issues that perhaps previously they didn't feel comfortable doing so. And so we were essentially flat in 3 months. We hadn't closed the divergence, but the percentage of participation, I said, what that means is people believe, like they believe that their voice matters. They believe that giving critical input, that something is going to happen to that, and that's a win. And then we hit the pandemic, so we haven't been able to really track that process. And so I was having a conversation recently about like what I thought the data would look like, and I suggested that the data may actually suggest that there is actually a greater convergence of the experience of belonging. I could actually almost see like a crisscrossing interaction for the very reason that gets mentioned, that the BIPOC populations, one, their experiences that they maybe had been having in face-to-face interactions, which they are no longer having, but also that they are able to go closer to communities from which they derive support and in which they thrive. And in having that additional capacity from engaging with those communities, it means that in whatever their work interactions are, they feel more full, more engaged, more able to show up, and despite like sort of whatever else anyone is bringing. And so that's actually one of my my research questions that I have on my phone that I type in that I want to investigate.
Well, you're going to have a great opportunity to get back into the research piece, which I want to come back to. But we've had another question come in as well. So how can you identify and articulate the relationship between a sense of belonging and the freedom to experiment, take risks, etc.?
How can I articulate that? So I'm just pausing because it's certainly something that we look at. So I think of the freedom to take risks, to experiment, to have your voice heard is falling into the realm of feeling psychologically safe.
Mm-hmm.
And that when people feel like they belong, it means that they feel that they are respected and valued, that potentially they have more latitude, that they can experiment more, that they can take risks, because the downside of taking that risk is going to be buffered by the value and respect that they have been shown. So I think those are really very integral concepts. I'm pretty sure that in our own data that they, at a minimum, they are correlational. Creating that environment where people do feel safe is incredibly important. And to be clear, creating a safe environment is not an environment absent criticism or developmental feedback. It is the spirit in which it is given. And in fact, in the absence of giving developmental feedback, which we know often doesn't go to individuals from BIPOC communities, URM or URG, they actually aren't able to realistically assess what opportunities there exist for closing gaps between where they are and where they need to be. And people will tell them, oh, everything's fine, you're doing great, but then they don't get promoted or they don't get the rating that they think they should have. And I'm talking broadly now, this is not an Airbnb specific phenomena, it occurs at universities, it occurs in a whole other places. So that psychological safety, and this is really, really critical, because we often hear that, we've gotten so focused on making sure everyone belongs that we can't give the feedback. No, making sure someone belongs, giving them feedback is the ultimate form of saying that they belong, that you want them to be there, that you value them, that you want them to have a great trajectory. It's the spirit in how it's conveyed.
Love that. I love that. I'm having multiple experiences going through my head. Absolutely. Okay. Last question, and then I'm going to turn to you. Colin asks, live like a local, belonging is at the core of Airbnb offer to guests. So how do you ensure belonging goes beyond your organization to its partners, customers, and others?
So I'm going to take this in the context of Airbnb, because I think if I don't, then people will feel like I'm running from the elephant in the room. So before I joined the company, but what is really well documented in 2016 was that there was a Twitter hashtag Airbnb You All Black, an emergence of anecdotes from many people, Black individuals, African Americans, about the experiences that they were having, particularly with getting accepted by hosts on the platform. So we're a two-sided platform. We have guests, we have hosts. We rely on hosts to provide places, and the guests are looking for places to stay. And our initial reaction wasn't great, because we're a company of belonging. So like a company of belonging, we want to create belonging for anyone, anywhere. Discrimination on our platform? Nah. Well, we we revisited that, and I think the three founders would say, as white males, I know because they have said it, their own lived experience had not created the capacity for them to recognize that human beings would bring discriminatory behavior onto the platform. And we can argue, and many of us have, that we all have a responsibility for stepping beyond our lived experiences. But the reality was that they didn't have that expectation. And so with the realization that there was a there, created an anti-discrimination product team, a community commitment that had an anti-discrimination clause to which all guests and hosts had to attest. We've thrown 1.4 million people off the platform for not being willing to do that. When someone, before instituting that, someone said to Brian Chesky, well, you might lose people. And he's like, I don't want people on the platform if they're not willing to attest to it. Right. And there are other companies that would have said, you know what, we're just the platform, what people bring to it, like that's not our thing. And then most recently, we've had Project Lighthouse, which was our declaration of a methodology that we're using to identify the perceived race in the United States historically of our guests, so that we can actually run analyses to see if there are differences in the experience. And the reason that we have to do it that way is because one of the things that we don't ask when people set up a guest profile is we don't ask race and ethnicity data. So that's not data that we actually possess. And there are a whole host of issues around privacy for our going in as a company and assigning a perceived race. And so we've come up with a process that privacy experts have lauded to be able to do that, and then to actually do the analysis. And so that's a long way away to say that we have really high expectations for ourselves, and we're on a journey to meeting those high expectations. I think the bar is always going to continually move, but if you say that belonging, connection are at the center, that's what you've declared you're going to do. And we have that expectation for our collaboration, for our partners, and specifically for our guests and our hosts. Like if they're on the platform, we have the expectation that they are going to at least adhere to the behaviors that we espouse.
That's great. Thank you, Melissa. And I know, the hour went by very quickly, and so we're right at noon, but I have to ask, so you've decided to make a return to academia this fall. A lot of what you've talked about, I think, are part of those reasons, and Airbnb has actually been incredibly supportive. So they're investing, have provided a chaired professorship, to do more research around this area. So kind of getting back to the theme of applied theory, applied, right? Like, yeah. What is next for DEI&B post-pandemic, and what role are you going to be able to play with this next generation of leaders that are coming through business schools?
Well, so there's no shortage of work out there in this realm. I will say that I'm incredibly grateful for Airbnb's support of research on connection and belonging, and I'm giving that to UVA and to Darden. I do have to note that my chair is from, which is not formally announced, but is from the generosity of a Darden donor, and the Airbnb funds are to support the research. Right. There is so we have to get more comfortable with one another. And we have to be willing to stretch beyond our comfort zone. We have to be in conversation I would love to see, and when I started Airbnb, and I think actually when I took the role at Darden, and we did some of this at Darden and then Vanderbilt, I want people to be in conversation with one another. I want them to be in difficult conversations facilitated. I want people to know that you survive, that being honest and respectful and civil as you talk about really hard things actually wins the day. And I think that there's so much room for us to cultivate that and to really create communities of mutual respect where people have differences, whether it's differences in political ideology, differences, a divergence in the religions that we espouse, but that there's a commonality and a civility and a willingness to listen and sometimes to create a sort of third realm of understanding. And so I would just, enlist everyone that's here today to really see, you care about ethics and you care about leadership, and diversity and inclusion and equity are all fundamental to good leadership. And that the extent to which you embed it and you ask the questions and you say, whose voice is not represented, whose perspective is not represented, how can we get that information? What's my own learning journey? How have I helped others? How have I lent my brand and my status to others? And sponsored them or separately mentored them. What is it that each person can do? I think it'll help us to all move along. So thank you, Kelly.
Melissa, I think that is a perfect note to end on. And thank you once again for your time and your perspective. And we hope that we'll be able to invite you again into the Fred community. And just thank you very much for your insights and your wisdom. And thank everyone for participating today.
Thank you so much for having me. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, Kelly. And thank you, Joe, so much for inviting me as well.
All righty. Bye-bye, everyone.